Well, welcome everyone. Excited you're here. Let's get this started. My name is Megan Patel. I help and launch scalable impact ventures. Specifically, I do that for Eric Schmidt, the former CEO of Google, his impact venture fund called Schmidt Futures. And I am honored and delighted today to be leading this panel of extraordinary experts and practitioners who are forging new paths to creating social impact. Specifically today, we're going to be talking about research. Why research? Well, research fundamentally helps us better understand the world around us. It helps us forge new areas of knowledge so that we can solve harder and more challenging problems. And with that as context, I would like to turn over to our panelists and ask all of them to answer what is something that is incredibly important for all of the audience here today to know about you as it relates to this panel. Start with Ruben. Sorry, Leslie.
Howdy all, my name is Leslie Robinson and I am the director of the Kendra Scott Women's Entrepreneurial Leadership Institute at the University of Texas at Austin. And something you should know about me and what I bring to this panel is just a researcher's lens, and that my dissertation is focused on gender smart approaches to teaching entrepreneurship education. So gender theory, feminist theory, from a phenomenological standpoint, what are the lived experiences of what it means to be a woman pursuing entrepreneurship education at an undergraduate level. So I'm excited to kind of share some of the promising practices that we've learned with the work that we're doing at WELI.
Perfect. I guess this is me. I'm Nisa Jetta from Impact for SDGs. I guess an interesting thing you should know about me is actually the fact that I'm addressing the question in the sense that trying to come to the table around contexts within the impact investing space, because I have, by way of background, I'm a qualified solicitor. I worked in policy and government. I then got roped into the private equity space doing emerging markets work, and then actually thought that there's no common vernacular when we're talking about the same goal. So a really big thesis of what I'm trying to do at Impact for SDGs, working across some of the major brands, investment managers, and governments, is that how do we really cross-pollinate on what we're saying with our words to get, our impact over the table. So very grateful to be here.
Hey y'all, I'm Alicia, and I wear quite a few hats, but today one of my hats is I'm a partner with the Pride Fund, who y'all will hear more about on the next panel coming right after this. I'm also a human rights commissioner for the city of Austin, so we work on all of our local non-discrimination ordinances here in the city, and frankly end up fighting the state a lot on issues like reproductive rights and gender equity and policing and a whole lot of other issues. And then the one thing that y'all should know about me today is that I am also here as an intersex activist. And y'all might not have heard that word before, but 2% of the world is actually born between male and female. So despite how I appear to y'all here, I actually have XY chromosomes. And instead of being born with a uterus and ovaries, I was born with internal testes. But I was unfortunately I was sterilized as an infant because there's this desire in society to normalize children to fit better into an A or B box, or in the case of this context, into an M or F box on a birth certificate. And so I felt it's important, although we're here talking about research, and there's a lot more research that needs to be done on the intersex community in general, but also the United Nations declared that these surgeries qualify as torture as of 2013. They're outlawed by international law. There are countries from Germany to Kenya to Malta, Greece have all outlawed these surgeries completely, and yet they still happen every day across the United States. And so I felt it was important, especially at a United Nations conference, to bring that up, and it definitely is a lens that informs all of my work as an investor, as an activist, as a politician. All of the different hats that I wear all kind of unify under that lens.
Go you.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Ruben, Cantu, and I'm the Executive Director of the Office of Inclusive Innovation and Entrepreneurship at the University of Texas at Austin. WELI Texas is a 2-year fellowship program for women of color at the University of Texas. We welcome everyone. We focus on that specific area. And the research lens that I bring in is, our thesis is, can we get our young women to reach director level role or higher within 10 years after leaving our program? Why is that? When we look at leadership across the board, for example, the Fortune 500, the makeup is very homogenous. You may have 1 or 2 exceptions, a couple of people of color, some women, maybe women of color, but it's very low. On top of that, to navigate up the corporate ladder, it's very hard for women and women of color to easily move in that direction. We want to help facilitate and provide those skills and training to be able to have a competitive advantage. On top of that, if these women also want to start a business, start their own ventures, getting funded, getting supported, getting backed is very difficult. So we want to teach them all the skills that they can, get them a head start in order to move forward. And so we're now in 2023? We're now in year 4 of this program that we've launched in 2020. And we're excited to see the work that we're doing year after year at the University of Texas. Our women have gone on to work at NASA, Congress, and work for the United Nations under the Secretary General, Antonio Guterres. So we're really proud of the work that we're doing.
Pretty awesome. Thank you. So many of you work on issues tied to addressing challenges that disproportionately affect underrepresented groups or marginalized communities. And I'm curious, how do you foster greater equity and inclusion? What's really difficult about doing this? And are there lessons or takeaways that you think is really important for this audience to hear? Anyone who would like to answer? Please.
I kind of often talk about this in my my space when I was really active in the investment management space, and I think that, exhibited within our panel, we're very cause-driven people, and it would probably be easier to not be cause-driven because it's sometimes more difficult to the question.
It would be so nice.
Yeah, I think it would just be easier, right? But it's not, and so I think that a really big part is having the other person come to the table and be incentivized to really understand, why is it hurting you? Why do you need to make a difference? What is it? And it's not going to be the same, and I think that's when, working across brands and managers, is that language becomes very important. So an example of that was I was working on a deal in an emerging market, and I was really trying to get my ESG strategy over the line, but we needed more capital. And I think that I had to then rejig how I was framing my argument to them and said that, if the ticket size is 50 million, what's another million to make it an impact story? And you could then metrify. You can't measure what you can't monitor. So we said, this capital, you can be part of hiring the C-suite women in this space. You can work on waste and sanitation. Did a lot of research and said that, investing in ESG from a negative screen on compliance actually outperforms the market, makes it a more robust business. You got to hire and train human capital. You safeguarded the brain drain from a country. These are all great things. And sometimes language really needs to be on the same side, because if I'm coming from a policy or an activism lens and I really need the investor to put in the ticket size, we're never going to be friends. And I think that's where the challenges are. And I think even panels like this, the cross-pollination of industries is huge.
Anyone else? Leslie.
Yeah, I'll answer in terms of what we see in serving women who are pursuing entrepreneurship. It's been, a lesson in the making. We're 3 years old, so we just turned 3, and we've really been focused on the community and what it is that students need and want from an institute to grow and support the number of women-owned, women-led businesses. That's our thesis, is to grow the number of support. And what we have found in some of the promising practices and the words that we use, not best practices, we have a long way to go, promising practices, are that representation is so important. We know that. But we heard again and again that if you can see her, you can be her. So just putting women and telling their stories and the journey about what it means to be a woman pursuing a business is critical. And also I think that there's importance in not just focusing on the challenges and barriers of being a woman in business, but we know the stats. We heard 2.2% of VC funding go to women. That's awful. But actually, it's even more awful in that it's actually 1.8%. So World Economic Forum in 2021 had an updated number. It's 1.8% of VC funding. And why that's important is that what we try to do at KSWELI is change the narrative, change the mindset. What are the strengths that women bring to business? What are the give backs? So forget about the revenue and the return on investment. That's all great, and you'll learn that in business classes. But what is the impact of the business that you are creating on the environment, social, political? What is that? Women naturally bring that into the foundation of when they build businesses early on, very authentically. And so we need to change the narrative on that being a success metric and really focusing and nourishing women to tell that narrative. And the other thing I'll say, which I'm obsessed with and I've heard a couple times today in terms of themes, is there's a feminist tenet of flourishing. So as you rise, as you're successful, it's not just about surviving or thriving, it's flourishing. It's creating an environment where everybody is successful, and that give back piece is huge for that. In the Austin ecosystem, we hear it as the rising tide lifts all boats. Well, it's actually flourishing. And so I really instill in my students, and I think that's the biggest promising practice, is that as you learn and grow, you have to give back at the same rate, and that's how we're going to change the numbers and the narrative.
I love that. I think that actually is a really perfect segue into this next question. So at Culture Futures, we actually care a lot about multidisciplinary research and teams. So getting teams that have not only different genders, different races, but also are working on different types of sciences or problems together, because we think when you put them in the same room, it often leads to novel solutions. And I'm curious from this panel, how have you tried to foster a multidisciplinary approach in your work, and what advice do you have for others trying to do the same?
You know, I have a background in entrepreneurship for over a decade, a little bit longer than that. Been coaching startups and pitch coaching for probably as long. And there's a particular routine and formula to try to get companies or founders funded, right? At least to get seed stage and to round A. And while a lot of people see that as a metric of success, how many people have you coached that have gotten funded? What I realized is a lot of these companies who get funded really don't know what they're doing either. Sorry. After a decade, I can say, and helping some of my former co-founders as well, like, we're all just trying to figure it out. The truth is, in terms of the multidisciplinary aspect, is one of the things that we really focus in our program is a really holistic approach of self-discovery. Yes, they learn how to build a business. Yes, they learn the metrics on how to make sure they mind the store per se. But before we go into building business models, we figure out who they are inside. We have them get in touch with their inner selves, asking deeper questions that they've never explored before. This is a trauma-informed, culturally informed curriculum that allows them to show up fully and discover who they truly are, so that when they step into the stage of leadership, this is our full, authentic self, and it's not something that was imprinted on them of what success looks like, but their own version of success, so that we can see a new version of leadership, not based in the patriarchy, but based on something that actually is authentic and what is needed today. So we combine many different philosophies in our training.
I want to add to that, because being an academic institution at UT Austin, we're a new institute, 3 years old, very intentionally created to be interdisciplinary. So to be involved in 5 colleges, Macomb School of Business, Cockrell School of Engineering, College of Natural Sciences, Undergraduate Studies, and the College of Fine Arts. And it was an intention to be interdisciplinary so that students who don't normally interact, have classes or an organization, come together at a neutral point in a welcoming community with strong sense of belonging to learn from each other. And what we saw, and what the great success from that was, is that the teams that are building an idea as a part of a class project, you have the finance major with the creative design major, with the marketing major, and that has been everything in terms of having that diversity of thought early on in creating a business idea as part of a class project. And what we're seeing is those class projects are becoming part of KSWELI and our founder program, because the team is so diverse and brings their strengths to the conversation and the business creation process. And that's awesome. It's awesome.
Oh, yeah, I think if you are going to have a multidisciplinary approach to something, you have to make sure you have one guiding ethos that like drives you and that unites all of it and kind of spreads across everything that you're doing. And I think sometimes people are confused because they see that I'm a venture investor and an appointed official and I have a book and a movie and all these different things, and they're like, well, what are
And
you?
you're awesome.
Well, thank you.
Badass.
But really, it's that my goal in life is all the same, which is kind of shattering stigma and in line with what you're saying, helping people be their true, authentic selves. So when we were back in the green room earlier, there was this amazing conversation between some of the panelists on the earlier panel about childbirth and some of the complications and how difficult it can be to come back to work and all these things. And like something like that wouldn't have been spoken about in public like 20 years ago. And so like women in certain communities are like making these huge strides, and unfortunately there's some that are still like so left behind. So I mean, I'll speak to intersex people, but also other people. For intersex people like me, it's not that there aren't a lot of us. There's actually the same amount of intersex people in the world as people who have red hair. So y'all have definitely met intersex people in your life. You just haven't known it because our issues are seen as taboo and like not something you can discuss at a dinner table or a boardroom table. But if you can talk about childbirth, why can't I talk about the fact that I was sterilized? That's my reproductive experience, unfortunately. It shouldn't be. But there are so many communities like intersex people, like the HIV positive community, like sex workers, that are still considered these like taboo topics that we're not allowed to talk about, let alone on stages, like just in everyday conversation. And until we break that stigma, then we're leaving so much talent behind, and like we're just we're not letting these people even get to the table.
Agreed. Very much agreed. Actually, on that perfect note of talent, because we're talking about the role of research in building talent networks for impact, we do have finite resources. Every single one of us does. And one of the most difficult things that I've found is when you have to select amongst a group of highly talented people, who are you going to bet on? When you can only choose one person for a prize or 3 people to be in a cohort. And I'm curious to hear from each of you, how do you decide whom to bet on? What metrics do you use? And how do you think about risk when selecting that talent?
Yeah, I mean, speaking with my Pride Fund hat on, so we are an early stage venture fund. We invest in LGBTQI plus entrepreneurs. The reason I use the full acronym is the I stands for intersex, not invisible. But so we bet on that community specifically for a variety of reasons. So LGBTQIA entrepreneurs statistically produce 30% more jobs than entrepreneurs that don't come from that community. And yet, unfortunately, we're seeing this massive flight of that talent from discriminatory states like Texas to the coasts. There's a Start Out Economic Equity Index. I said I wouldn't reference my phone. I don't remember exactly what it's called, but it was funded by JP Morgan. They put out these stats that show that over a decade, we've lost over 1 million jobs created by queer and trans entrepreneurs in states like Texas, because they all end up going to like New York and San Francisco. And that's bad for every Texan, not just for LGBTQI plus Texans. Like, we want those jobs here. We want those perspectives here. And so really it's like, we're betting on the folks that are unfortunately having to flee states like this. We want to keep them here. We want to retain that talent. We believe they're valuable members of this community. And so we choose actively to invest to help keep them here. So it has to go beyond the financial dollar. We have to really build that ecosystem too.
Go for it. You go for it. I might cough, that's why.
To go back to the question, the question about scarcity was brought up. And I think before I answer the full question, I think we need to clarify there's actual scarcity, as in resources, like Earth's resources. And then there's artificial scarcity that we create in our economy. Like, let's just call a spade a spade. And like, well, this is all we're going to spend this budget season. Understood that we have to be fiscally responsible. However, we are always operating from a scarcity mindset that doesn't allow us to diverge and create and explore new options. So in order for us to select the people, I don't just look at it from a scarcity mindset. I'm looking at it from a perspective of resilience. our students come from very challenging backgrounds. Some of them have come from traumatic backgrounds. There's a lot that we're working with there. And not to stereotype all of them, because some of them do come from privileged backgrounds. But the thing about it, how do I select who gets into our program? I sit down, I get to know them heart to heart. We have a real conversation. We have them apply, and we get to know each other so that we know and they know that they're fully enrolled into an idea of who they can become, how they can become that, and what resources they need in order to become that person. And so from us, we're looking at it from an abundance mindset that we may have limited fiscal resources, but we have a whole lot of love to give. And that oftentimes creates lots of miracles. And that's how I choose, is looking at the student who really has that grit and that resilience inside of them, that has that promise. And I can tell you, every single student that I have worked with in my program has demonstrated that.
I love that. So I guess there's three things I wanted to say. One actually touches on both of your points, and actually the question is that you've seen with the pandemic, resilience is kind of a thread that's gone through it. And I also even reference my own career. You know, growing up, it always seemed like it was pretty random, right? You studied policy, you went into, government, you did law school, you worked in finance, and at this stage, my parents were like, get it together, But at the same time, like any parent, but at the same time, I think it made me such a robust employee, because I always had my job, but I was always very hungry in parallel to do my policy stuff on the side or get things going. And so to your point is that once I was working on a deal again, and I noticed that we were in an economy and I looked very much like local Egyptian, and I didn't speak the language, but he literally put me through security, smashed my phone, and could not believe I was not Egyptian. And I was so lucky that I was with my colleague who was Armenian, but she spoke Arabic and she was able to transcend. And so I do think that when you're looking at employees, you need to have someone who really understands the commercial awareness, because how are you going to get to market? We were working on an ESG strategy, and we used something called the International Performance Standards, etc. We wanted funding from a development finance institution, and they didn't seem to care. But then when I flew down and I explained we need to translate it into French, they felt, you really want to help us. And I think that heart, and they became the biggest innovators, the biggest backers, the biggest people to tell us whether we were being lied by our staff. And I think that's when really interesting things come to light and you have more resilient staff, because they're incentivized to make it go to market.
So my approach to the question is, I look for the students who are entrepreneurial leaders. And so very much to the thesis of WELI and the program that you run, we focus first and foremost on the founder. So it's a little bit of a theory of change in that we don't focus on the business. There are 130 plus resources at UT that focus on entrepreneurship. We actually really want to grow the leader so that you know who you are, what are your strengths, what are your values, what is your business going to be built upon, so that you can step aside or differentiate yourself from the business that you're building, and really understand what you bring to the table and how you're going to build a team and who your co-founder is. And so it's really based on competencies of entrepreneurial leadership. And those are the students that are naturally drawn, I think, to the programming that we do, who might not have a business idea, but is a creative or is a leader or is a disruptor, and really needs to find that community that's going to nurture a place where they can find the juxtaposition, the intersection of what they're good at and what they love doing, in a way that is a safe place to try things out and to really redefine risk. And especially as women, we're naturally risk adverse, but to really then understand the beauty and necessity of risk and taking risk, and that actually that's part of the process and where the best lessons come from. And so the students that are involved in our program, really are visionaries and focused on, growing themselves as leaders to build businesses. And I think that foundation, not a lot of entrepreneurs spend time on it. And I think that that's actually where the successful founders come from, that then build successful businesses. And that's where we start. And that's, I think, what students are noticing and really loving and being enthusiastic about.
Thank you. Very helpful. Alicia, you kind of already started to answer this question, so I think I'll ask the others to start. But and I think we saw this also during the pandemic as talent was leaving companies, leaving to do their own thing, leaving to freelance. There's states, to your point, or countries where talent tends to leave because education or work opportunities or just simply the environment doesn't make them feel welcome.
Or the political environment.
Or, yeah, exactly, completely. What beyond money have you seen help retain talent?
Values, what a company stands for, and how to ask questions to get to the values of an organization, purpose-driven leaders, and to really know your values, to be able to align early on with the companies, to find that fit, like from the very beginning, and how to ask those questions in interviews to suss that out.
I hate to refer to Richard Branson, a white male, but he has a really good point here. He said, train people so well that they can leave you, but treat them so well that they don't want to. And I can tell you, and this is one of the things I train my students, is create a space where people want to come to work. Treat them as real human beings, see their humanity. We may not end up getting the exact pay that we get on the coast, but you have a sense of home here. And it's not that we should be taking advantage of that and not paying people what they're worth, but there's something to be said of knowing that you love to go to work with the people around you.
Good quote. Good answer.
My thing, it's similar to you, values, or I felt in a lot of my workspaces the community lacking. Like nobody thought the same way, or it was kind of lonely. And so I feel like if anyone went to my flat, they would be like, this is just so stereotypical of like a startup person. But there's a Post-it that like really always kept me going at like the 4 a.m. whatever. And it was, I don't even know who wrote it, but if you want it, create it. And it's similar, right? Like every time you would create something so that you can hold the space for the next person to not feel that way, or you would create it so that you want to be there and you want to build. And I think that has just been my overall thesis on what I do for work. So yeah, it's a really good question.
Yeah, I think there's also just like structural barriers. So like, I won't use the political word, but structural barriers too. Like when you're in a state like Texas where the state level leadership will block insurance coverage of basic things like HIV drugs, like PrEP and PEP, or will not allow for basic family planning, or these things that not only determine our lives and our ability to like survive and thrive, but our ability to succeed economically, then it does get harder to retain good talent and keep people there. So I think it's all connected.
So I love asking questions, but I also would love to ask the panelists, is there a question you would like to ask someone else on the panel?
I have a question for you all, because I will never be a woman. There's no way. I don't know. What is the future of leadership what does the future of women leadership look like for you? What do you hope to see in the future? And how can I help?
That's a great question.
Do you want to answer? You've been moderating.
Yeah, like what else do you see? Like I'm so interested to also for you, like what are you seeing within the space, or the biggest hurdles, you know?
I think so many of you have brought this up, but it is so hard to have a dream when you have never seen something like it happen before. And to be able to see suddenly a woman leader where you're like, oh, I could be like her. But in so many spaces and places where there aren't that and there's an absence, I've seen many women fighting to create their own version of what executive presence looks like or what leadership looks like that isn't just a replication of what men do. And that brings, personally, I really care about joy and like how can I be joyful in the workplace and not have it be disrespected or be told that like you're not allowed to be happy where you are. So I really truly hope that the future of women is flourishing and collaborating with each other to lift one each other up, and to believe that there can be a different way of working. The statement I lead our women's group with is, the world we as women desires, it can be won, it is real, it exists, and it is ours to create. I will turn it back to you.
Yeah. I think it's also, like a quote I heard recently, it's not that we're in a financial debt crisis, we're just in a debt crisis of like female leadership and that type of talent as well. So I do feel that, I do feel that we really need to hold the space because it's very important. Like I think the biggest lesson was I was at the UN quite, wide-eyed once, and I was like, wow, like, I just would love to do that one day, And it's because you have to just have that democracy of access and be able to be there and see these people and talk to them. So I want to enable people to feel like that, and it was amazing.
I think because women were never granted a seat at the table, we've had to like claw our way in. And so for a long time, there was almost this idea of like, if we see one woman succeeding, then that's preventing my success, or like,
Totally.
yeah. And I think that I see with like millennials and Gen Z, like I think we're starting to phase out of that. And a lot of it is based on privilege, that we are starting to get more access to these spaces, and so our mindset can shift. But I hope we can just take that one step further. That's like, okay, now that women are starting to get seats in these spaces, like who is still left behind? Like Black and brown folks, like queer folks, all these other communities who are still disproportionately not getting those seats. Like now that we're getting them, let's not pull the ladder up from under us. Like let's keep bringing people with us.
And sorry, just to your point, which I found so interesting, is that intergenerational dialogue, which you talked about, is that, like, I think it's so important, like, when we talk about diversity, we also have to talk about diversity of age. And one of my friends who's a mom was a bit older, and she was like, I love talking to my kids because they're non-binary. She's like, Nisa, they don't see, like, sex, color, and that's amazing to just, like, go through a next generation to say, it's flat. Now let's work on actual problems, Sorry, I cut you off.
No, that's good. I just was going to close. I brought my iPad out, which means I have a stat to bring up. The researcher in me wants to get these citations correct. And it's a reality check, and it's that the UN recently stated that it will take 286 years to achieve gender equality. And so it's a gasp moment, and that we have a lot of work to do, but I do find hope in this next generation that we're gonna get there faster. But also we need the allies, we need the conversations, the panels today with so many women taking the stage and telling their stories, normalizing this. If you can see her, you can be her. And I think that, and that's where I find the hope in stats like that just seem crippling sometimes.
Well, thank you all. Thank you for the question. Thank you for the
you.
answers.
Thank you.
This was great.
Thank you.
Awesome.